Before we begin today's story, I want to ask you something personal. If you lost everything, your family, your home, even your sense of hope, and somehow still managed to win a life-changing prize, what would you do with it? Would you take it and finally breathe again? Or would you give it all away for someone else? Today's story isn't about winning. It's about choosing not to take, and the courage that kind of choice demands. It's about a girl who had nothing but a voice, and used it not for herself, but for someone the world forgot. If you believe that real strength isn't in what we take, but in what we're willing to give up, here we share true stories that'll make you proud of kindness, of sacrifice, and of the quiet heroes walking among us. Let's begin. At a small public high school tucked away in Des Moines, Iowa, the air inside the auditorium was heavy with anticipation. Rows of folding chairs filled with students, parents, and teachers faced a stage framed by deep red curtains and washed in the sterile glow of overhead lights. It was the final round of the annual statewide speech competition, The Voice of Tomorrow, and despite the modest venue, the stakes were sky high. A $25,000 cash prize. A full scholarship to a prestigious private high school. And for many, the promise of a new beginning. Backstage, hidden behind a partition of black fabric, stood a girl who looked like she didn't belong there at all. Her name was Sophie Lane, 14 years old, and every inch of her spoke of hardship, yet carried a quiet defiance. Her sweater was faded and too big, the hem fraying at the wrists. Her jeans had been patched more than once. Her hair, a soft golden brown, was tied back in a simple ponytail, secured not with a ribbon or barrette, but with a worn shoelace. She held no phone in her hand, no cue cards. Just a folded piece of paper, smudged at the edges from being read 100 times in secret, under blankets at night, in quiet corners of the orphanage, or during stolen moments between chores. Sophie was an orphan. Her parents had died in a tragic car accident 3 years earlier, and since then, she'd lived in a group home with other children the world didn't know what to do with. She had no family to cheer her on from the audience, no friends waving from the front row. But what she did have was a voice. And that voice had been discovered by the only person in that school who truly saw her, Mr. Reynolds, a graying, thoughtful literature teacher in his 50s who noticed how Sophie lit up when she read aloud, how her words carried weight far beyond her age. "You don't just read," he once told her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder after class. "You speak in ways that make people feel seen." He was the one who had encouraged her, no, pushed her, to enter the competition. Sophie had hesitated at first. "Who would want to listen to me?" she'd asked. But Mr. Reynolds had smiled and said, "Sometimes the people with the least to say have the most important things to share." And so, here she was. A name was called from the loudspeaker. Next up, Sophie Lane, representing Des Moines North. The crowd offered a polite smattering of applause as Sophie stepped out into the light. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply walked to the podium, placed her paper down, and looked out into a sea of unfamiliar faces. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. And then, with a voice steady but soft, she began. "I didn't come here to win. I came to say something I've never been allowed to say." The room went still. Even the judges, seated at their long table with pens ready, paused mid-note. She didn't rush. Her eyes swept slowly across the crowd, not in fear, but with a sense of purpose. The kind of gaze that made people lean forward, made them listen. "All my life, I've been told to be quiet. That my story was too sad, too complicated, or just too much. That I should be grateful to have a roof over my head and not ask for more. But I do have something to say. And I hope, just for a few minutes, you'll let me say it." Whispers died. Phones were lowered. Even the restless shuffling of teenagers settled into silence. Sophie's voice had that effect, like a thread of music you didn't realize you needed to hear until it was already wrapping around your heart. She spoke of loss, not as a wound, but as a shadow that taught her to notice light. She spoke of silence, not as absence, but as space waiting to be filled with something true. And more than anything, she spoke not just for herself, but for someone else. But that part, she would save for later. When she finished, Sophie folded the paper gently, bowed her head, and stepped away from the microphone. And still, no one moved. Then, applause. It began like a soft ripple, and within seconds, it surged into a standing ovation. Judges stood. Teachers clapped. Even students, some of whom had smirked at her shoes when she first walked in, were now wiping their eyes. Backstage, Mr. Reynolds watched with a proud smile forming on his lips. He didn't clap. He simply whispered to himself, "That's my girl." The announcement came after a long, breathless silence. Sophie stood off to the side of the stage, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out the quiet murmurs from the audience. The judges were still seated, but they looked different now, no longer stern or analytical, but moved, shaken even. One of them, a silver-haired woman with glasses sliding down her nose, wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her blazer. Another sat motionless, his pen frozen midair, as if afraid to disrupt what had just occurred. Then the head judge rose and approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice rough with emotion, "our panel has reached a unanimous decision. And to be perfectly honest, we've never seen anything quite like this." The crowd leaned in. This year's winner of the Voice of Tomorrow competition is Sophie Lane, Des Moines North. The room erupted. Applause thundered through the auditorium like a storm breaking. Cheers, shouts, whistles. Some people jumped to their feet, others clapped with tears in their eyes. Students looked around in disbelief. This girl, this quiet girl in a second-hand sweater, had just swept one of the most prestigious competitions in the state. Sophie didn't move at first. For a second, she looked frozen, like the moment hadn't fully landed. Then, someone backstage gently nudged her forward. She stepped out once more into the light. Flashbulbs popped. A few people took out their phones to record. The host gestured for her to come stand center stage. A large ceremonial check was displayed on a stand to her left, $25,000. On the screen behind her, her name flashed in bold white letters against a deep blue background. Champion. The head judge extended a microphone toward her. "Would you like to say a few words, Sophie?" She reached out slowly, wrapped both hands around the microphone, and paused. There was something in her face, calm, but determined. The crowd expected joy. Maybe laughter. Maybe tears of gratitude. What they got was something else entirely. Sophie cleared her throat softly. "I want to thank the judges," she began, "and everyone who listened to me today." Polite applause. "But," she continued, her voice unwavering, "I need to say something important." The applause died. "I can't accept this prize." The room fell absolutely still. One could almost hear the air being sucked out of the room. A few people gasped audibly. In the wings, Mr. Reynolds leaned forward, eyes narrowing, lips slightly parted in surprise. "I know this is supposed to be the moment where I say how much this means to me, and it does. But I didn't come here for the money. Or even the scholarship." She looked out into the audience, into the hundreds of faces now blinking at her in confusion. "I came here to tell a story," she said. "But not my own." Now the tension deepened. Even the judges looked uncertain. Someone near the front row whispered, "Is this part of the speech?" Another voice answered, "I don't think so." Sophie took a step forward. "There's someone else who deserved to be on this stage today. Someone who applied just like I did. Someone who had something powerful to say, but couldn't." The microphone trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear, but from something deeper, conviction. "And I used my voice today, not for myself, but for him." Gasps again, this time mixed with murmurs of intrigue. Sophie turned toward the judge's table. "With the deepest respect, I ask that the prize be reconsidered, not for me, but for the one whose voice wasn't allowed to be heard." Another stunned silence. The host, standing just off to the side, looked unsure whether to intervene. One of the judges whispered something to another, and for a brief moment, there was chaos, quiet but tangible. A contest like this had strict rules, protocol, precedent. And here was a 14-year-old girl, throwing all of that into question. But Sophie didn't flinch. She looked back at the crowd, now no longer cheering, but watching, eyes wide, hearts caught in their throats. This, she said, lifting the microphone slightly, was never about winning. And with that, she lowered the mic, stepped away from the podium, and left the audience sitting in stunned silence. Sophie didn't move from the stage. The check was still behind her, bold and untouched. The applause had long since faded. The silence now was different, no longer curious, but reverent, expectant. She reached slowly into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a small worn sketchbook. The corners were curled from handling, and the cover bore faint smudges of charcoal and graphite. She held it in both hands for a moment, like something sacred, then raised it for the audience to see. "There's something I want to show you," she said softly. Some in the front rows leaned forward. The judges exchanged glances. The host took a step back, giving Sophie space, unsure what was about to unfold. "In the group home where I live," Sophie began, her voice calm but steady, "there's a boy named Elijah. He's 11 years old. He's lived there for most of his life. He doesn't speak, not because he's shy or afraid, but because he physically can't." The audience was utterly still. "But Elijah," she continued, gently opening the sketchbook, "he has a voice. It just doesn't come out in words." She turned the first page. The audience couldn't see the drawings clearly, but they could feel something shift in the air. Her eyes dropped to the images, then lifted again to the crowd. "He draws. Not like a kid playing with crayons. He draws. He creates these whole worlds, people, places, moments that somehow feel more real than anything I've ever said out loud." She paused, flipping to another page, then another. "I remember watching him submit his application to this competition. He sat for hours with our counselor, trying to explain what his speech would be, through pictures, through gestures. He drew it all, his dreams, his fears, the things he wanted to change in the world." Sophie looked directly at the judges now. But he was turned away. Disqualified. Because he couldn't speak. You could have heard a pin drop. That night, I sat with him on the stairs. He handed me this notebook. Didn't say a word, just looked at me. And I knew. She held the sketchbook to her chest. So I used my voice to tell his story. Several in the crowd gasped. One of the teachers near the back blinked hard, swallowing a lump in her throat. Even the judge who had wiped away tears earlier was now openly crying. Sophie took a slow breath, then stepped forward again. "I didn't write my speech to impress anyone. I wrote it so that Elijah's voice could be heard, through me. Every line I spoke today came from what he drew. The silence he lives in every day. I tried to break it, just for once." Then, she held the sketchbook high. "This is his speech," she said. "These drawings, this is how he tells the world who he is." She opened to a page in the middle. "This one," she whispered, her voice trembling now, "this one shows a boy in a classroom, trying to raise his hand. But everyone's back is turned. No one sees him." A soft murmur of heartbreak rippled through the crowd. "I don't want the prize," she said. "Not because I don't need it. God knows I do. But because someone else deserves to be seen." She looked out at the sea of faces, some stunned, some in tears, some simply frozen in awe. If this competition is really about finding the voice of tomorrow, maybe we need to start listening to the ones who can't speak. Because silence doesn't mean someone has nothing to say. There it was. The sentence that stopped time. The judges no longer scribbled notes. Cameras weren't flashing. Nobody reached for their phones. They just listened. Sophie closed the sketchbook gently and stepped away from the podium. She didn't need applause. And for a long, long moment, there wasn't any. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that follows something holy. By the time Sophie returned to the group home that evening, the internet had already exploded. Clips of her speech had gone viral, shared by students in the auditorium, teachers, and even one of the event volunteers. Within hours, her name was trending on social media. A video titled "Girl Refuses $25,000 Prize to Honor Silent Friend" had already racked up hundreds of thousands of views, with captions like "True Courage" and "The Voice of a Generation." Twitter and Facebook flooded with reactions. Some praised Sophie as a hero. That girl just changed how we define leadership. Incredible. A child speaks more truth than most adults ever will. If this doesn't make you cry, check your pulse. But not everyone saw it that way. The criticism came just as fast. Another teenager chasing attention. So dramatic. She could have taken the money and still helped the kid. Feels performative. Who gives up life-changing money just to prove a point? A handful of online pundits questioned whether the story was even real. Is there even a boy named Elijah? One local blogger wrote, "Let's not romanticize teenage martyrdom." She made an emotional choice, not necessarily a wise one. The reactions weren't limited to social media. Morning talk shows featured short segments with snippets of Sophie's speech and emotional reactions from the audience. Radio hosts debated whether her decision was noble or naive. Even national outlets picked up the story. CNN ran a piece titled "The Girl Who Gave It All Up for Someone Else." But perhaps the most powerful headline came from a small local newspaper. She refused everything, for a boy no one knew. And that stuck. People began referring to Sophie as the girl who said no. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, chaos brewed. The competition committee, stunned by the unexpected turn of events, convened an emergency meeting that same evening. Held in a small boardroom at the state education office, the atmosphere was tense. The panel of judges, organizers, and event sponsors sat around a rectangular table cluttered with printouts, legal documents, and half-empty coffee cups. No one had seen this coming. "Has anyone ever declined the prize before?" one judge asked, still looking dazed. "Not in 30 years of this competition," the director replied. "And certainly not to give it to someone who didn't officially compete." The room fell into uneasy silence. "It sets a precedent," another added. "If we honor this request, we're saying anyone can nominate someone else for a prize, even if they didn't submit or follow the application process." "But can we ignore the message?" said the silver-haired judge, the same one who had teared up during Sophie's speech. "Are we really going to pretend this didn't move the entire state?" A younger sponsor representative pushed back. "It was powerful, yes. But this is a formal competition. We can't bend the rules just because a speech went viral." Someone else chimed in. "But what does it say about us if we don't?" A girl stood on stage and used her platform to uplift someone completely voiceless. "Isn't that exactly what we claim this competition is about?" They debated for hours. Every option raised a new challenge. They could honor Sophie alone, but that would ignore her intent. They could split the award, but there was no precedent for giving any part to a non-entrant. They could deny her request and move on, but no one could say that out loud. Because the truth was, they had been changed too. No rubric could measure what Sophie had done. No score sheet could capture the silence she turned into sound. And none of them could forget how the entire room had frozen when she held up that sketchbook. Finally, the room fell quiet again. The director leaned back in his chair, eyes closed for a long moment. Then he opened them and said quietly, "We need to think bigger. This isn't just about a contest anymore." The day after Sophie's story hit national airwaves, a quiet ripple began in the local paper. It wasn't a flashy headline. There were no dramatic photos or viral sound bites. Just a column buried on page 6 of the Des Moines Herald, written by someone who had been there from the beginning, Mr. Jonathan Reynolds, English teacher at Des Moines North. The headline read, "Redefining What It Means to Have a Voice." What followed was a short but powerful essay, just under 500 words, that changed everything. Mr. Reynolds wrote, "I've been teaching for over 25 years. I've seen eloquence. I've heard brilliance. I've graded essays so sharp they cut. But what I witnessed this week wasn't about polish or grammar. It was about courage. A girl stood in front of a crowd and used her voice, not to win, but to lift someone who couldn't speak for himself. A boy named Elijah, who draws instead of talks, who sees instead of speaks. Maybe it's time we ask ourselves, what is a voice really? Is it only sound? Is it only words? Or is it something more, something that can live in a look, a brushstroke, a moment of silence? Because I believe we've been listening with our ears for too long. Maybe it's time we start listening with our hearts. Some people don't speak, but they still find ways to move us. And if we're willing to truly listen, they can change the world. It didn't take long. The article was shared first by the Herald's Facebook page, then by teachers across the state, then by organizations supporting nonverbal and disabled youth. Within hours, the words had circled the country. Within a day, the essay was being quoted by journalists, spoken aloud on radio shows, and printed onto posters. Screenshots of the article flooded Instagram and Twitter, accompanied by hashtags like Listen With Your Heart, Voice Redefined, and Justice for Elijah. But more than the viral traction, it was the tone that changed. The public stopped arguing. They stopped debating whether Sophie's gesture was too much or not enough. They started asking something else entirely. What if this was a turning point? And it was. That same week, the Voice of Tomorrow committee reconvened, not in crisis this time, but with clarity. For the first time in the competition's long history, they made a unanimous decision to amend their rules. They announced a new award, the Empathy Honor. It would not be given for eloquence, not for stage presence, not for performance. It would be given for heart, for those who, through courage and compassion, found a way to speak beyond words. And the first recipient would be Elijah. When the announcement was made, it was accompanied by a statement from the board. We recognize that communication takes many forms, and courage does not always arrive with a microphone. Beginning this year, we will honor individuals who inspire empathy and connection, especially those whose voices are expressed through non-traditional means. Photos were released. Elijah, holding Sophie's sketchbook in his lap, looking down at the pages he had once drawn in solitude. In the background, Sophie stood behind him, hands resting gently on his shoulders, not saying a word, but somehow saying everything. That image became iconic. It was printed in newspapers, circulated in school newsletters, featured on digital billboards, and even framed in the office of the competition director. At Des Moines North, the news hit like a burst of sunlight. Students cheered in the hallway. Teachers stopped by Mr. Reynolds' classroom just to say, "You were right." Sophie didn't say much. She simply smiled when someone asked about Elijah's award and whispered, "He earned it." As for Mr. Reynolds, he received hundreds of emails from strangers, parents, educators, artists, and people who had never spoken aloud in their lives but had finally felt heard through his words. One message read, "For the first time, I feel like my daughter's drawings are enough. Thank you." But Mr. Reynolds didn't take credit. He said what he always had, that the lesson didn't come from him. It came from a girl with an old sweater and a voice bigger than the stage she stood on. And a boy who never spoke a word, but made the whole world listen anyway. After the firestorm of media attention settled and the awards were officially adjusted, something even more powerful began to take root, something that went far beyond trophies and headlines. A few weeks later, Sophie received a call from one of the event's private sponsors. The woman on the other end, a former speechwriter turned philanthropist, had been deeply moved by Sophie's story. She didn't offer advice or congratulations. She offered a check. "It's not the competition's money," the woman said. "It's mine. And I want you to use it for whatever matters most to you." The amount was modest by corporate standards, but monumental to a 14-year-old girl. Sophie stared at the envelope for hours before finally opening it. $20,000, written out in her name. And she knew exactly what to do with it. With Mr. Reynolds' help and guidance from local educators and advocates, Sophie founded a program she named See My Voice. It was a simple initiative with a powerful mission: to give children who could not speak a platform to express themselves through images, illustrations, and visual storytelling. The program began as a weekend art club hosted in the basement of the group home. But word spread fast. Volunteers came forward: artists, teachers, counselors, even local gallery owners. Within months, See My Voice expanded to 3 community centers and partnered with a national nonprofit that supported children with speech disorders. Sophie didn't lead with fanfare. She stayed behind the scenes, organizing supplies, setting up chairs, helping students mix colors. But every Saturday morning she was there, early, quiet, smiling. And so was Elijah. After receiving the first-ever empathy honor, Elijah's life began to change in quiet but profound ways. For the first time, he was seen not as the boy who didn't speak, but as the boy who created. One of the judges, who also taught at a prestigious visual arts academy, personally reached out to offer Elijah a full scholarship for the upcoming fall. His enrollment was met with quiet celebration at the group home. A banner was taped up across the kitchen wall: "Congratulations, Elijah, artist in residence." But the most unforgettable moment came one afternoon in late spring, in a classroom where Sophie was helping clean brushes. Elijah approached her, holding something behind his back. When she looked up, he gave a small nod and handed her a drawing, carefully folded, the paper thick with soft pastel strokes. Sophie unfolded it slowly. The image took her breath away. It showed a young girl at a podium, speaking into a microphone. Her mouth was open, her eyes focused, her posture confident. Below her, drawn with equal care, was a boy seated on the floor with a sketchbook on his knees, drawing. The light in the picture radiated from both of them, not from the microphone or the artwork, but from something unspoken between them. Sophie looked up, eyes glassy. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice catching. "Did you draw this for me?" He nodded. In the bottom right corner of the drawing, he had written, in block letters, "Our story." No other words were needed. That drawing would go on to become the emblem of the See My Voice program. It was printed on every brochure, every flyer, every invitation to gallery nights hosted by the children involved. It became a symbol of what could happen when one person used their voice to make room for another's silence, and how together, those voices could build something louder and more beautiful than anyone expected. Years later, when asked about the drawing during a school interview, Sophie simply said, "He gave me something I could never give myself, proof that listening is a form of speaking too." The auditorium was filled again, but this time it wasn't for a competition. It was graduation day. Rows of folding chairs stretched out beneath a stage decorated with streamers in navy and gold. A banner hung across the back wall: "Des Moines North Class of 2024, the future is yours." Parents whispered excitedly, siblings waved hand-drawn signs, and teachers sat in neat rows near the front, faces glowing with pride and nostalgia. Among the students in their caps and gowns sat Sophie Lane. She wore her gown like everyone else, no honor sash, no extra cords. Just the standard navy robe, the mortarboard hat sitting slightly crooked over her loose waves. But people knew who she was. As the crowd began to settle, the buzz of whispers seemed to hum around her like electricity. "That's the girl from the story. She started that art program, right? She's the one who gave up the scholarship for that boy. What's his name again?" But Sophie didn't seem to hear any of it. She sat quietly in the third row, her hands resting on something in her lap, something flat, wrapped in brown paper, with the corners slightly curled from age. The ceremony began with speeches from administrators and student leaders. One by one, graduates were called to the stage, shaking hands, smiling for photos, accepting their diplomas. The audience clapped politely, until the principal paused at the podium with a shift in tone. "We have one final recognition," she said. "This student asked not to give a speech today, but we believe her story has already spoken louder than words." There was a murmur through the crowd. A few people leaned forward in their seats. The principal looked down at the paper in her hands. "Sophie Lane, will you please come to the stage?" Sophie stood, still holding the wrapped object close to her chest, and made her way up the stairs slowly. The audience applauded, some politely, some with genuine enthusiasm. But no one really knew what to expect. She reached the center of the stage and paused, facing the crowd. Then, without a word, she unwrapped the paper. Inside was the drawing, Elijah's drawing. The one he had given her. The one with the girl speaking at a podium and the boy sketching beneath her, their voices joined in silent harmony. Sophie turned it outward and lifted it high. No speech. No explanation. Just that image. That single image. The crowd sat in stunned silence for a moment, taking it in. The lines of the drawing were soft but intentional, the emotion undeniable. Even those in the back rows could see what it meant. They could feel it. And then, someone in the middle row stood up. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet. The applause was thunderous, but not rowdy. It carried a strange kind of reverence, like something sacred had just happened. People clapped with tears in their eyes, some covering their mouths, others standing with hands at their hearts. Mr. Reynolds stood too, quietly, off to the side. He didn't clap at first, just watched. And smiled. Sophie didn't bow. She didn't wave. She simply nodded once, lowered the drawing, and stepped down from the stage. That moment became the most talked-about moment of the entire graduation. No words. No speech. And yet, it said everything. Later that evening, a local reporter asked Sophie why she chose not to speak. Her answer was simple. Sometimes the best way to be heard is to let someone else's voice echo through you. If you believe that a voice isn't just something we hear, but something we feel through brave and quiet acts of compassion, then let this story live on. Leave a like to honor those who speak without words, where we share stories that remind us of the goodness still alive in every human heart.